Okay, we are back with Rudolf Steiner, and the next couple of lives that he goes through in karmic relationships. And by the way, just to throw out a plug, I do private astrology readings for anyone who's interested, and also Patreon contributions always help keep this stuff alive. All right. So what we are looking at here is a diagram from the 1496. This was published in 1496, the Practica Musici by the musician Gaforius. And by this time, note in 1496, the Ottomans have already taken over Constantinople in 1453 and chased out all these monks and priests who brought over all the texts to Florence of Plato, Plotinus, and the Corpus Hermeticum, as well as lots of other goodies. So by this point, in the classical tradition is already being synthesized together with Christianity and Christian myths and symbols. Botticelli is already paid in the Primavera by 1480. And has already started with this process of synthesizing the symbols. And so that is exactly what Gaforius is doing here. And the reason we're going through this is because Steiner has this idea that in the life immediately after death, the soul ascends through these spheres. And in the old order here, the Ptolemaic order, which is a little difficult to grasp and or believe, but I've got a theory that makes sense out of it, that I think that what the whole thing about Rudolf Steiner is that his work is a mixture of truth with metaphor and myth, and so they're entwined. Sometimes he's picking up on things that are true, but that he translates into a mythical idea, such as, for example, in near-death experiences, we often hear the passage through a portal at death or a tunnel of light. And I think that's what Steiner is saying when he talks about the soul going through the moon gate at death. Near-death experiences weren't known in his time, and so we didn't have that image of going through a portal or a tunnel, but he calls it the moon gate. And I think that's a metaphor that he was using to the best that he could to use his intuition to pick up on that idea. So you kind of have to work with Steiner and sift, through, try to disentangle the myths and the images from the truths of what he's actually saying. That's why I'm constantly researching near-death experiences with people like Raymond Moody, who was incredibly erudite, far more erudite than I ever realized. I've been watching a lot of him, and cross-checking him back with what Steiner says. And more often than not, there's correlation of one sort or another. Not always. But Steiner does use metaphor a lot. And so before we do that, it's good to have this classical paradigm in our heads here. So what we have here is Apollo sitting on his throne here in place of God, emanating, and here are the 9 muses, and the 9 muses dance around Apollo as the 10th to form a Pythagorean tetractys, and Apollo is a patron of the arts. Instead of his lyre here, he's got a stringed instrument, a lute perhaps it looks like, and then the 3 graces are over here. They are unclothed. Note that. The muses are clothed. Note that. Because as the soul is unclothed on the other side, let's say, and when it descends, it puts on the clothing of the planetary spheres and their qualities, which are over here on the right side. They descend from Saturn through Jupiter, Mars, the Sun, Venus, Mercury, the Earth, and then through the spheres of the elements. Ignis is fire, air, and then aqua, water, and then finally earth. And the 9th muse here is Talia. Now note that Talia is one of the three graces, but also one of the 9 muses. Only the difference is, up here, Talia's in the middle and she's unclothed. So in a way, we're meant to think of Eve before the fall. Down here, below the earth, we are meant to think of Eve after the fall. So that's one dimension to this. And the other is that Goetherius describes her as silent Talia, Surda Talia, because the earth is immovable. And this is the music of the spheres. He's got the diatonic scale on this side with the names of the notes on this side. So, and as the spheres turn, and they turn because of the power of Apollo here, and his grace that descends down through them, and the music that they generate, that he generates, is the music of the spheres. And that's the sound that each of these planetary spheres makes as they turn. They make us a different note, a different sound. And indeed, actually, in some near-death experiences, I've often heard that let's say, take the case of Eben Alexander, who was a neuroscientist who was an atheist and had an incredible, one of the most vivid near-death experiences I've ever heard described. And when he got onto the other side, he fell into this, it seemed like he woke up in this black murk that he couldn't figure out. And then he saw this sort of spiral of light coming toward him, and it was making music, and it was making sounds. And he could hear the sounds, and the music was absolutely beautiful. And the sounds would pull him up into the beautiful world, where the colors are vivid, and there's plants and trees and vegetation, and everything is like it's like the difference between an IMAX movie and a shitty black and white TV. That's how dramatic the difference is between this world and that world. And everyone who's had a near-death experience agrees on that. The music of the spheres is a real actual thing. Let me just make an adjustment here. Okay. And it's in the tradition. So, notice that the direction of the serpent is the opposite to that of the Kundalini serpent, which rises up through a series of chakras. And instead of the chakras here, we have planetary spheres, which are kind of equivalent to Steiner's idea of the chakras in a way. And it goes all the way up to the throne of God. Now, in Egypt, the god Serapis would sit on the throne with Cerberus, the three-headed god, or the three-headed dog that guards the gates of hell. And so Goetherius is meaning to refer to Cerberus, who has 3 heads and a snake's tail, and would sit at the feet of Serapis. So Goetherius wants you to think of that. And these 3 heads, though, are also evocative of the 3 animals that Dante meets at the beginning of the Inferno, the lion, the leopard, and the wolf. Only here we have the lion, which represents the present. You put your head in the lion's mouth and you're engulfed by the present. And the wolf is over here. Yeah, so the wolf is over here. The wolf drags away its prey, so it represents the past. And the dog sniffs out the future. And so that represents present, past, future. And so Talia is silent because we poor humans on the earth have our ears closed to the music of the spheres. When you're born, you don't remember the other side. And there are reasons for that, good ones, actually. You can't live your life really swamped by memories of all your past lives. It's too many fucking memories, and besides that, you won't learn anything. You have to make your mistakes afresh based on previous karma. So there's a reason for the forgetting. But because of the formation of a brain and a mind that's oriented towards survival on the physical plane, we've lost touch with the music of the spheres. We can't hear their harmonies anymore. And so that's why Talia, the first of the muses here, is silent. Okay, so then we have over here, we have Clio, which is the muse of history, and she is correlated with the moon. The moon governs the tides of history, let's say. And then we have Calliope, the muse of epic poetry. She's the mother of Orpheus, who is correlated with Mercury. That's the mind, and I suppose the epic poets like Homer who are working these things out, although Steiner has a different reading of Mercury, which we'll see. And then Terpsichore is the muse of dance, and she corresponds with Venus, and in the Christian tradition, especially in the Puritan tradition, such things are banned. As the Taliban, for instance, bans dance. They have many things in common with the Puritans. And in the movie Footloose, we have a popularization of that idea. Melpomene is the muse of tragedy, which, as Aristotle said, is cathartic and purifies us through the sun door. And then we have Erato, who is the muse of love poetry, and so she correlates with Mars. And then above her we have Euterpe, or rather Erato. Let's see, I missed Erato. Erato with Mars, love poetry. And then Euterpe, the muse of music, which corresponds with Jupiter. So we're ascending into higher and higher spheres. And then with Polyhymnia, we have the muse of sacred poetry, which with Saturn and his scythe begins to cut us free from earthly attachments. And then finally Urania, the muse of astronomy, sends us out into the firmament, into the realm of the celestial stars. So it's as though as we ascend, we lose our garments, because as the soul descends, it picks up the garments, let's say, of the qualities of these spheres. But as it ascends to the throne of Apollo, it arrives there naked. Now, the oldest version of this idea of the soul putting on the body like a set of clothes, let's say, goes way back to ancient Sumer with Inanna's descent through the 7 gates of the underworld. And indeed, those 7 gates did correspond to the 7 planets. And at each gate, as she descended, she had to give up an article of clothing, a piece of jewelry, her robe, and eventually she stood naked before the throne of her sister, the goddess of the dead, Ereshkigal. So that's the oldest version of that idea. And so the soul stands naked here before God. And we have the 3 graces, and Euphrosyne, in the Christian tradition, is turned away from him, and so would represent the principle of rebellion. Talia is in the middle, and as we have said, she represents Eve before the fall. And then Aglaia is turned toward him, which is the proper stance, beholding the beatific vision. Now, note too that in the Kundalini Yoga, the serpent ascends, and it gets to the chakra between the eyes, which is the Agya chakra, which is the visionary chakra that beholds the vision of the gods. But here we don't have an equivalent of the top chakra, the 7th chakra, Sahasrara, which is achieved through samadhi and the unification with what Sri Aurobindo calls Satchidananda, or Brahman. So we don't have an equivalent of that here. But we could find that in Plotinus, I think, with his idea of the one, which was directly inspired by the idea of Brahman. Okay, so now what Steiner says is that the first thing the soul encounters after it does its life review, it goes through the moon gate, does its 3-day life review, which he astonishingly already had figured out, and every near-death experiencer that I know recounts it. The life review, which has to do with your own observation of your deeds and the harm that you have caused others, only you experience it from their point of view, and also the good, but it's a moral evaluation. It's a kind of equivalent of the Egyptian judgment of the dead, except that you're the one doing the judging. It's up to you whether you lived a satisfactory life or not. And so Steiner says we leave our moral qualities behind. and the immoral ones, especially in the moon sphere. Then the soul ascends to the Mercury sphere, which instead of the mind, he says has to do with health and illness. Now, of course, we know that Mercury is tied, the symbol of Mercury, the caduceus, is tied to the medical profession. And Asclepius was the god of healing. He had a staff with only one serpent going up it, whereas Mercury, the guide of the souls to the underworld, had a staff with two serpents, which the medical profession inherited. So there must be some ancient connection there between Mercury and the medical profession. But Steiner says the illnesses are left behind there in that sphere. Then the ascent to the Venus sphere, of course, has to do with love and eros. Steiner is in full agreement with that. That karma is dealt with there. And then in terms of his pantheon of the angels, the lowest, the group of the angels, governs the sphere of the moon. The archangels governs the sphere of Mercury, and the archai governs the sphere of Venus. But when we get to the sphere of the sun, where the soul spends the most time and the longest time, we have the middle three in his pantheon, the exousiae, the dynamis, and the kyriotets. Those are all working on your karma. And this has to do with the heart, love and compassion. And he says that the moral qualities, you can't enter the sun sphere if your immoral deeds have outweighed your moral deeds, because those all have to be left behind in the sphere of the moon. Let's say a serial killer can't make it out of the sphere of the moon. He's not going to be allowed entrance into the sphere of the sun. And any immoral qualities, bad things that you have done, especially meaning you can translate that as harm to others, have to be left behind. And so Steiner puts it in a certain sense that the soul can enter the sun sphere in a kind of mangled state. But healing takes place and a long time is spent there, which then allows ascent to the sphere of Mars, which he agrees has to do with aggressiveness and courage. So much of this does correspond to astrological meanings. And then to the sphere of Jupiter, which has to do with the wisdom. And then finally to the sphere of Saturn, which has to do with the past, according to Steiner. And so now, given that, he says that when individuals reincarnate, usually one or the other of these planets will predominate. And he didn't believe in astrology, but it's remarkable that what he says about these individuals, and here we'll investigate Heinrich, Heine, and Goethe. It's remarkable that their birth charts correspond to exactly what he says, even though he didn't believe in astrology. Now, with regard to this ascent through these spheres, I think this can be translated into the idea that I've heard many near-death experiencers say that they're actually planes of existence, sort of as it were stacked one atop the other on the other side. I've heard it described as 6 planes or 7 planes, with the Earth being the 7th. So the spheres that he's talking about in the traditional classical language can be translated into this idea of there are different planes where the soul ascends based on its ability to forgive and love in life. And the more forgiveness and love that a soul has given on the earthly plane, the higher the planes of existence that soul gets to enter into and work with the spiritual beings that are there. So that's what I think he's talking about here. So the first life then that he investigates is that of the 19th century German poet Heinrich Heine, whom I have not read, 1797 to 1856. So his dates are exactly the same as that of Goethe. Now he says that Heinrich Heine, in his case, 3 planets predominated when he was on the other side: Venus, Mars, and Mercury. He had poor eyesight, so he had problems in the Mercury sphere, which has to do with health and illness. But those 3 planets predominate. So I went to look up his birth chart to see if those 3 planets were aspected. And indeed, of course, they are. Here's Venus, here's Mars, and here's Mercury. And they are all very heavily aspected. You can see here that Mars is squaring Venus. And Venus is sextiling Jupiter. And Venus is opposed to Saturn. Not a good aspect to have. That can produce emotional coldness. And then Saturn is trining his Mercury conjunct Mars conjunct Neptune, rather. And Mercury is heavily aspected as well, with a sextile to the moon, and it's squaring Uranus. So indeed, those very three planets that Steiner said that Heine spent the most time in correlate to his birth chart. So it's kind of like, what the fuck is going on here? How can that be? Because I've never heard a single near-death experience or talk anything about going through planetary spheres. Different levels maybe on the other side, which I think code for the spheres, but it sure is interesting to me that what Steiner said correlates to their birth charts. So something mysterious is going on here. So now let's look at the past life of... oh, by the way, he said regarding Heine's past life, he lived in India, but he doesn't say anything else about him. Let's see, Goethe. Here's Goethe, just so you have a visual on him. One of the greatest writers that Western civilization has ever produced. Everyone is in agreement on that. Born 1749 to 1832, so his dates match pretty closely those of Heine, who I regard as a minor poet. Everyone's minor compared to Goethe. I mean, this is the author of Faust, one of the fundamental works of Western literature, up there with Dante's Inferno, let's say Don Quixote, Ulysses, Finnegan's Wake, Paradise Lost, Moby Dick. Those are the fundamental works of the West that you can't get by without having read. The Sorrows of Young Werther was his first novel he wrote as a young man that made him famous. And, of course, I did a video on his scientific interests and so forth. And he says disappointingly little about Goethe's past life. All he says is that in one of Goethe's past lives, he was a Greek sculptor. So presumably he was a sculptor in the time of 5th century Athens, one of the great sculptors. This would explain his love of classical civilization. And then he had several female incarnations, Steiner said, in between that incarnation and becoming Goethe. But now he says that Goethe spent the most time in the sphere of Jupiter, which is the sphere of wisdom. And he brought that Jupiterian wisdom with him down onto the physical plane when he incarnated. So let's look at Goethe's chart. And indeed, here's Jupiter, and it is hit by so many planets. I would say it's hit by the most planets. Here we have it, Jupiter trine Neptune, which would explain his spirituality, his spiritual impulses. We have it quincunxed by his very bright intellect, Sun conjunct Mercury there. Some astrologers don't use quincunxes, but I find them necessary sometimes. It's opposed by Venus, hence his interest in the arts. Jupiter and Venus are very good for the arts. And let's see, by Pluto as well. It's trined by Pluto, which is the desire for power. And indeed, Goethe was an ambitious man. He held several political offices. So wham, wham, wham on Jupiter here. Exactly what Steiner said, even though he didn't believe in astrology. So there must be some sort of Jupiterian plane, let's say, that has to do with wisdom, which made Goethe a very highly evolved, coming to being as a very highly evolved individuality. Some of his other aspects are interesting too. He's got Pluto trining his Neptune. Neptune, that's an interest in the occult and the esoteric. Goethe's interest in alchemy, let's say, and the Hermetic tradition. He's got Neptune sextile Venus, which is good for spirituality through art. and then he's got Saturn. Let's see, Saturn square Uranus, which can make for irritability and moodiness, actually. And indeed, Thomas Mann wrote this very comical novel called The Beloved Returns about Goethe and this guy who's wandering through Germany, looking for, in Weimar specifically, looking for Goethe. He interviews Schopenhauer's sister, and then at the end of the novel, it climaxes with a dinner party at which Goethe is at the head of the table, and he turns out to be a total disappointment, just kind of an asshole. And it's very, very funny. You're looking for, Mann builds up your expectations to hear this, like Eckermann's conversations with Goethe, and it turns out to be a total disappointment. The guy's an asshole, which I suspect probably has a lot of truth to it. He's got Mars trining his very bright Sun conjunct Mercury, which gives a lot of force and aggressiveness and power to that, as well as disputatiousness with the Mars and the Mercury. That causes argumentativeness, and Goethe liked he was very disputatious especially with the guys who rejected his metamorphosis of plants. So that's it, pretty much, for my reading of Goethe. But the whole point is the correlation between what Steiner says the souls spend their time on the other side, and the correlations between their birth charts. So we'll end there with that video.